The Declaration of Pillnitz stated that the situation of the King of France was an object of common interest to all the sovereigns of Europe. It invited the other powers to join in the employment of the most effectual means to put the King of France in a state to strengthen in the most perfect liberty the basis of a monarchical government equally becoming to the rights of sovereigns and to the well-being of the French nation. If the other powers agreed, the two kings declared themselves ready to act promptly. Privately, the Austrians at least recognized that there was no prospect of other powers joining a crusade, and at this very moment they were disbanding regiments. For them, the declaration was to satisfy monarchical and family honor, a move that might even promote some moderation within France, but scarcely a serious threat. But in that case, it was needlessly provocative to state that it was issued at the request of the émigré princes, or to allow the latter to publish it together with an inflammatory letter to Louis XVI, urging him to reject the Constitution. The Constituent Assembly, therefore, came to an end amid rumors of an émigré invasion backed by foreigners. And in the last gesture of defiance towards international opinion, the deputies finally voted on 14 September to annex Avignon and Comtat. The prince's appeal to their brother had come too late. On 3rd September, the Constitution was completed and presented to the king for acceptance. On the 13th, he signified his acceptance amid scenes of rejoicing and a general amnesty. The revolution the Feuillants were determined to believe was now complete, and ordinary constitutional life could begin, ushering in, so they hoped, calmer times. But much of the rejoicing was really at the approaching end of the Constituent Assembly, which came on 30 September. Its achievements had been enormous. In 26 months, it had dismantled the ancient regime, the product of centuries of slow evolution. At the same time, it had laid down the principles of a new order and established structures whose outlines were to endure down to our day. When, later in the Revolution, or well into the next century, men spoke approvingly of the principles of 1789, they meant those accepted by Louis XVI in 1791, before the revolution went to extremes. Yet, the seeds of those later extremes had already been sown, and the Constituent Assembly was responsible for them too, by forcing the clergy to choose between church and state. It had split the country and given counter-revolutionaries a higher cause than self-interest. In its very last days, the Assembly deepened this self-inflicted wound by unilaterally seizing papal territory. The religious schism made it impossible for millions to give the new order their wholehearted support, beginning with the king himself. Only those who dared not think anything else believed by 1791 that his acceptance of the Constitution was sincere. He had already shown and said what he really thought at the time of what he now chose to call his journey in June. But that created a further split between constitutional monarchists and a rapidly growing Republican movement, all the more alarming in that its mainstay was the turbulent populace of Paris. As to the nobles who had done so much to launch the revolution, most had by now opted out, hiding themselves in rural obscurity or slipping across the Rhine to join the princes. None of this promised well for the fuyant dream of post-revolutionary life. The British ambassador's prediction of April 1791 was truer than ever by October. The present Constitution has no friends and cannot last. Chapter 7, Europe and the Revolution, 1788 through 1791. The French Revolution took the whole of Europe by surprise. To be sure, all educated Europeans were aware in the 1780s that they lived in an age of upheaval and defiance of authority. America had thrown off British sovereignty, and Ireland had defied it. In the Dutch Republic, self-styled patriots were struggling to deprive the Prince of Orange of what quasi-monarchical powers he retained. But if any great monarchy seemed destined soon to collapse, it was not that of the French Bourbons, but that of the Habsburgs. restless and unpredictable. The Emperor Joseph II was turning his German dominions upside down in a headlong attempt to create a rational, efficient military despotism. By the middle of the decade, he was switching his attention to his more outlying territories, Hungary and the southern Netherlands, and soon both were in turmoil. French diplomats positively encouraged all these developments. Without French help, American independence could not have been achieved so rapidly and decisively. The Dutch Patriot movement also stood in the way of Orangist attempts to reforge the century-long alliance with the British, ruptured in 1780. So the Patriots were promised every support from Versailles. And anything which preoccupied Joseph II domestically was to be welcomed if it curbed his international adventures. But Vergennes, the friend of foreign rebels, was a stern authoritarian at home. Neither he nor the foreign observers who watched him confidently deploying his master's international influence discerned that the ground was crumbling beneath him. Yet, within 6 months of his death in February 1787, France too was in turmoil. The first sign that France had been internationally weakened by domestic crisis came in September 1787, when she failed to keep her promises to the Dutch patriots and allowed the Prussians to march into the Republic and crush their movement. The chanceries of Europe registered the change instantly, and not without some gloating. If God, wrote the British ambassador to The Hague, wished to punish them in the way they have sinned, how I should admire divine justice. Apparently God did. For the next 4 years, the French became ever more preoccupied with their internal problems, and their international power withered away. Diplomatic relations were conducted, for the first time in centuries, without regard for what the French might think or do. Their apparent inability to restore financial or practical stability amazed and amused the rest of Europe, at least down to the summer of 1789. Until then, few onlookers knew what to make of it all. But with the fall of the Bastille, suddenly and simultaneously, throughout the continent, the meaning of what was going on in France seemed to fall into place. The Bastille was a state prison. Its storming marked the overthrow of despotism by subjects who until now had known no liberty under kingly rule. The news was romantic and thrilling. All over Europe, people thronged bookshops and reading rooms, clamoring for the latest information. "I do not know where to turn," wrote a German lady, "for the papers contain such great and splendid news that I am hot from reading." The leaders of German literary life were almost unanimous in welcoming the events in France. Philosophers like Kant and Herder, poets like Klopstock, Hölderlin, and Wieland were enraptured by what they heard. Even those like Goethe and Schiller, who were more skeptical right from the start, following the news avidly. Richer and more adventurous Germans took the road to Paris to observe the new liberty at first hand, and one at least became notorious there: Anacharisis Cloots, a wealthy Prussian nobleman who had left France in 1785, vowing never to return until the Bastille had fallen. He was in Sicily when it did, and hurried back to throw himself into the democratic politics he had hitherto only dreamed of. The impact was similar among the intellectuals of Italy, who rejoiced to see what had seemed the most well-established of states shattered by popular uprising, and then rededicating itself to national reform. Wholesale reform was not, after all, just for dreamers, or for Americans free to start again in virgin territory. It could take place in the heart of Europe, in the continent's very intellectual capital. That meant it could take place anywhere, as far away as Stockholm. The news from France was the talk of the salons and cafes. "Tell me," wrote the young Swedish poet Kellgren to his brother, "was there ever anything more sublime in history, even in Rome or Greece? I wept like a child, like a man, at the story of this great victory." In St. Petersburg, there was jubilation in the streets, and a vast expansion in the circulation of news sheets. Russians were present at the fall of the Bastille. In fact, "The cry of freedom rings in my ears," rhapsodized one of them, Count Stroganov. "And the best day of my life will be that when I see Russia regenerated by such a revolution." One country in Europe felt no such need. In 1788, there were widespread celebrations in Great Britain to mark the centenary of the Glorious Revolution, which had thwarted Stuart despotism and finally established parliamentary government and the rule of law. Englishmen reveled in their freedom, and had traditionally regarded the French as slaves to tyranny, superstition, and poverty. They were now benevolently interested to see their neighbor catching up. Fox, leader of the Whig opposition, proclaimed the fall of the Bastille the greatest and best event in history. And while not all British observers went so far, there was little initial hostility. It will perhaps surprise you, one member of the Parliament wrote to a correspondent in France on 28 July 1789. But it is certainly true that the revolution produced a very sincere and very general joy here. It is the subject of all conversations and even all the newspapers, without one exception, though they are not conducted by the most liberal or most philosophical of men, join in sounding forth the praises of the Parisians and in rejoicing at an event so important for mankind. And meanwhile, those who had seen more recent attempts at revolution suppressed or aborted took comfort and encouragement. Many of them were already refugees in France anyway. Genevan Democrats, whose attempts to widen the circles of political power in the city-state had been crushed by armed intervention by a league of neighboring powers. Led by France in 1782, hoped the new regime in Paris would abandon its oligarchic puppets. Shamed at its failure to help the Dutch patriots more tangibly in 1787, the dying absolute monarchy in France had at least extended hospitality to refugees from Orangist and Prussian vengeance. By the end of 1788, perhaps 1,500 Dutch families had been granted residence and small pensions by Louis XVI. When power in France fell into the hands of men who also called themselves patriots and sought to share power more widely, the Dutch exiles were delighted, largely concentrated in a handful of towns in French Flanders. By 1790, they were forming clubs and setting up National Guard units. The National Assembly, recognizing spiritual allies, continued to subsidize them too, although its pacific professions and military weakness offered them scant hope at this stage of reversing their defeat of 1787 with French help. Most of the Dutch exiles, however, did not penetrate as far as France. The vast majority of the 40,000 or so fugitives from the Orangist reaction ended up nearer home in the Austrian Netherlands, or the ecclesiastical Principality of Liège. Belgian resistance to Joseph II's rationalizing policies in church and state was gathering momentum by the time of the Dutch political exodus. The refugees found the atmosphere of defiance, as well as linguistic affinities, congenial. But the issues at stake in Belgium were very different from those preoccupying Dutch patriots. The opponents of William V had sought to change the way things were done. In Belgium, it was the distant emperor who sought change. His Flemish and Walloon subjects merely wanted to be left alone. In 1787 and 1788, that brought them closer to the French than to the Dutch. But whereas by 1789, the French had moved on and were looking to create a whole new order based on liberty, the Belgian rebels remained largely wedded to protecting existing liberties. That whole complex of customs and prescriptive rights, which French patriots were now beginning to denounce as unjust and meaningless privileges. Both conflicts came to a head in the first half of 1789, however, and during the excitement of the struggle, few noticed the increasing divergence between the French and what they called the Brabant Revolution. The day after the Third Estate in Versailles proclaimed themselves the National Assembly and claimed the sole right to authorize taxation, Joseph II demanded that the estates of Brabant grant him a limitless right to tax and legislate. 18th June 1789. When they refused, he dissolved them and renounced the joyous entry, the Charter of Liberties, which he, like all preceding sovereigns, had sworn to uphold on his accession. The grain shortage that was so important in France at this moment also affected the crowded cities of the Low Countries. And as in Paris, the hungry populace threw its weight behind the opponents of authority. Here, as in Paris, in fact, became the popular cry in Brussels, and a secret revolutionary society was established to tap anti-Austrian feeling. Using a slogan already favored by Irish and Dutch paramilitary reform organizations earlier in the decade, it called itself Pro Aris et Foscis, for altars and hearths. And it was generously funded by the church, which here as elsewhere in the Habsburg Empire had borne the brunt of Joseph II's reforms. No popular uprising came, however, until companies of armed exiles intervened in the autumn the acknowledged leader of resistance to the emperor, the colorful Brussels lawyer Vandernoot, had been in exile in Holland since August 1788, hoping to interest foreign powers in his compatriots' plight. Spurned by monarchs, well content to see Joseph II mired by chaos in Belgium, eventually he turned to armed self-help. In cooperation with the founder of Pro Aris et Fossis, his fellow lawyer Vonck, in October 1789, he organized an invasion which overwhelmed the small, overconfident Austrian garrison. The insurgents came not just from across the Dutch frontier, but from Liège in the south, where in mid-August, opponents of the Prince Bishop had seized power, visibly encouraged by the example of France. By December, the Belgian rebels, backed by popular uprisings, were in control of the entire country. And in Brussels, everyone was wearing national cockades like the French, but here in black, yellow, and red. On 10th January 1790, at the invitation of the Estates of Brabant, representatives of all the provinces met and declared themselves an independent United States of Belgium. The chorus of approval from France was unanimous, but almost at once it became clear how little the two revolutions had in common. The new statist regime sought only to carry on as before, but without a monarch. Power was to remain with the estates of the various provinces, dominated as they were by great nobles and above all the church in the form of its traditional representatives. The abbots of the greater monasteries. Vandernoot, now installed as first minister, had no sympathy with a France where the lands of the church had already been confiscated. Monasteries were about to be dissolved, and noble power had been broken. Vonck, however, felt that the moment of establishing a new political order was an opportunity for reform. At the end of January, he issued an appeal for constitutional change, obviously inspired by the French example. He called for the admission of petty nobles and parish priests to the estates, the doubling of third estate representation, and the creation of a fourth estate representing small towns. Even this was conservative by the standards now reached in France, but it was bitterly denounced by the statists and the church as a formula for Frenchified leveling. When Vonck's progressive petition for a modification of the joyous entry, the people of Brussels attacked the houses of their known leaders. When part of the new Federation's army mutinied in support of Vanck, thousands of peasants poured into Brussels to protect the statists. Isolated, persecuted, and in a tiny minority amid their deeply conservative countrymen, Vanck and most of the leading progressives fled to France, thus confirming all the worst suspicions of their persecutors. Yet neither France nor the French example were any real threat to the new Belgian regime. The danger still came from Austria. Joseph II, who had touched off the original revolt, died on 20th February 1790. He was succeeded by his brother Leopold, who initially at least had no despotic ambitions. Grand Duke of Tuscany since 765, Leopold had sought to rule in Florence with the cooperation and participation of his subjects. He had positively welcomed the first news from France in the spring of 1789. The regeneration of France, he wrote on 14th June, will be an example which all sovereigns and governments of Europe will be forced, willy-nilly, to copy. Infinite happiness will result from this everywhere. The end of injustice, wars, conflicts, and arrests. And it will be one of the most useful fashions introduced by France into Europe. By 1790, he was less sanguine, but he still had no intention of following Joseph's high-handed policies in Belgium. In fact, in March, he offered to confirm the entire new statist regime in return for acknowledgement of his sovereignty. He received no reply. Subsequently, he approached Vanck in his French exile, offering to support the progressives if they would work for his restoration. Aware of his liberal reputation, they negotiated for a while, but now they were being radicalized by the French atmosphere, and the contacts lapsed. Only then did Leopold resort to force. First, he cleared the diplomatic decks by reaching an accord with Prussia, which had been on the point of war with Joseph when he died. Called in as mediators in the Liege Revolution, Prussian troops now straddled the route to Belgium. But when Leopold assured King Frederick William II that his intentions were pacific throughout Europe, Liege was evacuated. And on 27 July 1790, the two German powers concluded the Convention of Reichenbach. Under it, Leopold agreed to end Joseph's war against the Turks, going on since 1787, seeking no substantial territorial gains. Thus reassured, Prussia agreed to stop supporting rebels against the Habsburg crown. Whether in Hungary or Belgium, peace was duly made with the Turks in September, releasing the necessary troops, and the recovery of Belgium began. The new state's army was swept aside. So were irregular companies of peasant volunteers raised in what was known as the September Crusade. By the beginning of December, Austrian soldiers had overrun the whole country, and Liege into the bargain, where the bishop returned on their coattails. Vandernoot fled once more to Holland. The United States of Belgium had lasted less than a year. No friends came to their rescue. The British, traditional protectors of the Low Countries, had actually helped to engineer the Reichenbach Agreement. And the French, who were not consulted, looked on with indifference. They had now recognized how little Vandernoot's revolution had in common with their own. And besides, only on 22nd May, the National Assembly had elevated France's diplomatic nullity to a point of principle by declaring that the nation renounced offensive warfare. The question arose when a request for diplomatic support arrived from Spain. A year earlier, off Vancouver Island in the far Pacific, Spanish coast guards had tried to arrest British merchantmen in Nootka Sound on the grounds that the entire west coast of America was Spain's. When the news of the incident arrived in Europe, the British refused to accept Spanish claims, and both sides began to mobilize for war. Madrid now invoked the Family Compact. The alliance with France, repeatedly renewed over the centuries since its first conclusion in 1733. Louis XVI and his ministers were inclined to send the help requested, even at the risk of war. But the National Assembly, confronting diplomatic questions for the first time, spurned the Spanish request. A national representative regime did not recognize family ties between ruling houses as fit bases for international agreements, much less action. And so, although much traditional Anglophobia surfaced in the Nootka Sound debates, and there was intermittent talk of readying the fleet, the Spaniards were offered no tangible help and were forced to back down. The revolutionaries felt proud of the way they had refused to perpetuate dynastic diplomacy. 2 months later, they raged against another specimen of it when Leopold, still nominally France's ally, sought permission for Austrian troops to cross French territory on the way to Belgium. Fears now began to be expressed for the first time of an international plot to attack France and destroy the revolution. Marie Antoinette and her circle might dream of it, but nothing could have been further from the truth. As the Turkish War in the East came to an end, the great continental powers were more than happy to leave France wallowing in what they saw as helpless chaos, while they turned their predatory attentions to Poland. In 1772, the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians had combined in the first partition to deprive Poland of a third of her territory and population. What was left was little more than a Russian puppet state, but under it many Poles schemed and planned for a national revival when an opportunity should present itself. It did so in 1788, when the Russians became distracted on two fronts by simultaneous war against the Swedes and the Turks. Between October 1788 and January 1789, the Polish Diet threw off Russian control and began a massive expansion of the Army to protect the country's recovered independence in the future. The advocates of this program called themselves patriots, and they warmed to the news by then coming from France. Educated Poles knew that France was their country's traditional friend. Many read and spoke French, and they felt involved in a common struggle against despotism. When they read the French news which flooded the Warsaw news sheets, but as with Belgium, apart from rebellion against established authority, the situations in Poland and France had nothing in common. Political life in Poland was a noble monopoly, and the Diet was outraged when, in November 1789, 141 towns subscribed to a petition calling for non-noble representation. Liberty in Poland meant golden liberty. The anarchical old constitution in which the king was elected and exercised no real power. Legislation could be blocked by a single contrary vote, liberum veto, and dissatisfied elements enjoyed a legalized right to rebel. The Russians, for their own reasons, favored these arrangements and styled themselves guarantors of the Polish Constitution. Patriots, on the contrary, became identified in the course of 1790 with a stronger executive, including a hereditary monarchy, majority votes in the Diet, and an end to legalized rebellion. Only modernization on this scale, they thought, could give Poland the strength to resist Russia in the future. And with the Convention of Reichenbach signaling the imminent end of the Turkish war, the matter became urgent. On 3rd of May 1791, the king and the patriots combined to push a new constitution through a thinly attended Diet surrounded by troops. The phraseology of the 3rd May Constitution contained many echoes of that being elaborated in France at the same time, and its supporters organized themselves into a club called the Friends of the Constitution. Again, the parallel was superficial, but so was the perception of the Polish magnates who had been the mainstay of the old constitution, and so, above all, was that of Catherine II of Russia. The new Polish constitution was, in her eyes, plainly Jacobinical. Catherine had been determined to recover control in Poland from the moment it was lost. The echoes of France she discerned there made her all the more determined. Paradoxically, it would be the actions of the French revolutionaries in 1792 which would enable her finally to do so. Meanwhile, however, Western Europe seemed to be adjusting to the new order in France. Much of the initial enthusiasm had cooled when the fall of the Bastille was followed by a continued upheavals. The October days, in particular, dismayed many observers of orderly disposition, and hardly anybody outside France thought the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille worth celebrating. But the full extent of the revolution's quarrel with the church, to which the vast majority of Europeans belonged, was not evident until the spring of 1791, and pity and puzzlement, rather than alarm, were the predominant attitudes in 1790. People were no longer sure what to think. In November of that year, however, a powerful and persuasive voice began to tell them, with extraordinary success. In that month, Edmund Burke published his Reflections on the Revolution in France. Initially, Burke had been no more than anybody else what to make of French events, although he was never swept along by the enthusiasm of some of his fellow Whigs. But what outraged him was the inspiration the revolution had clearly given to the movement in Great Britain for parliamentary reform. Originating in the late 1760s, agitation for the redistribution of parliamentary seats, shorter parliaments, and extension of the franchise had flagged in the mid-1780s after a ministerial reform bill introduced by Pitt had failed to pass. The centenary celebrations in 1788 revived interest in reform, particularly among dissenters excluded from the franchise by religion. Dissenters proved one of the mainstays of a revolution society established to perpetuate these revived aspirations. And it was a leading dissenting minister, Dr. Richard Price, who stung Burke into action with a sermon preached under the auspices of the Revolution Society in 1789 on 4th November, birthday of William III, the hero of 1688. France, Price implied, had now overtaken Great Britain in the pursuit of liberty. Its religious laws were more liberal, and its system of government more representative. And with news of the October days still the topic of every conversation, he thanked God that I have lived to see 30 millions of people, indigent and resolute, spurning at slavery and demanding liberty with an irresistible voice. The king led in triumph, and an arbitrary monarch surrendering himself to his subjects. Burke's indignation at this interpretation of French events knew no bounds. It triggered an impassioned denunciation of the revolution in Parliament in February 1790, which left his fellow Whigs dumbfounded. And in the following November, it produced his great pamphlet. What had happened in 1688, he protested, was not revolution in the new French sense, but rather the preservation of hallowed English liberties from the attacks of a monarch bent on subverting them. Reverence for ancient institutions and established practices was the true English way. In fact, it was the only way for any self-respecting nation. Yet the French had spurned this principle, repudiating the wisdom of their ancestors and heedless of the consequences for their posterity. They were now in the process of renouncing their entire heritage. You had, he told them, the elements of a constitution very nearly as good as could be wished. But you chose to act as if you had never been molded into civil society and had everything to begin anew. You began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you. The mildest of monarchs and the most beautiful of queens had ruled over a spirited, honorable, and cultivated nobility, a respectable clergy, and an independent judiciary. The monarchy had been a despotism rather in appearance than in reality. And, with a little modest adaptation, the Estates General might have become a body as representative as the British Parliament of the nation's true interests. But the elections of 1789 had brought to power not the natural landed interest of the country, but country curates and obscure provincial advocates, stewards of petty local jurisdictions, country attorneys, notaries, and the whole train of the ministers of municipal litigation, the fomenters and the conductors of the petty war of village vexation. Was it to be expected that they would attend to the stability of property, whose existence had always depended upon whatever rendered property questionable, ambiguous, and insecure? It was not. And in fact, an assembly dominated by such men had embarked on a confiscation of property unparalleled in history. By the time Burke finished the Reflections, the lands of the church had been nationalized in what he saw as a momentum of ignorance, rashness, presumption, and lust of plunder, which nothing has been able to resist. This expropriation had been used to launch a fraudulent paper currency with no possible stable future, and had necessitated a civil constitution which no honorable cleric could submit himself to. It seems to me, he concluded, that this new ecclesiastical establishment is intended only to be temporary and preparatory to the utter abolition under any of its forms of the Christian religion. These thoughts brought Burke to the causes of the revolution. Convinced that nothing was fundamentally wrong with the old order, he attributed its subversion to a conspiracy. On the one hand were the moneyed interest, resentful at their lack of esteem and greedy for new profits. On the other, and even more important, were the so-called philosophers of the Enlightenment, a literary cabal committed to the destruction of Christianity by any means and every available means. The idea of a philosophic conspiracy was not new. It went back to the only one ever conclusively proved to have existed, the plot of the self-styled Illuminati to undermine the church-dominated government of Bavaria. The Bavarian government published a sensational collection of documents to illustrate its gravity, and Burke had read it. Although he was not the first to attribute events in France to conspiracy of the sort thwarted in Bavaria, the way he included the idea in the most comprehensive denunciation of the revolution yet to appear lent it unprecedented authority. Nor was the destruction of Christianity and the triumph of atheism the only catastrophe he predicted. Disgusted by the way the Republic of Paris and its swinish multitude held the government captive, the provinces would eventually cut loose and France would fall apart. The assignats would drive out sound coinage and hasten, rather than avert, bankruptcy. The only possible end to France's self-induced anarchy would come when some popular general who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery and who possesses the true spirit of command shall draw the eyes of all men upon himself. Armies will obey him on his personal account. The moment in which that event shall happen, the person who really commands the army is your master.